Today I'm going to talk about an interesting object that I think is museum worthy, at least in my opinion. It's the sort of object that you could find in a box at your grandfather's in the closet, and then you go on the antique roadshow and the appraiser gives it a wild estimate and the person's eyes pop as if they just had a quad mocha at Starbucks. And I'm not on that show, so perhaps the producer does indeed slip them a quad just to get that reaction. The reason I chose this item is its value is not immediately obvious. Now you could have, for instance, a first edition of The Great Gatsby with a dust jacket, and you can go online and you can compare condition, and there are parameters to establish a reasonable valuation for an item like that. But I tend to purchase items, books, manuscripts of interest of the type that I have to think about in terms of their historical importance, their value. It's sort of like I'm going on a date, I ask the item out, and after a couple of dinners I have to decide, am I going to whip out my Amex at Tiffany's, or do I have to give that whole "it's not you, it's me" speech? In professional parlance, I would say I like to see how the item catalogs, meaning once I have placed a description down on paper, have I effectively conveyed its historical importance with both honesty and passion, so much so that I have convinced a collector to share that to an institution and actually buy the item. This is a deed from the 17th century. Now, in and of itself, a deed from that period is not usually valuable. It might be a nice handwriting specimen of the period, but they were often written on very strong and durable vellum animal skin that would put to shame, those 1980s posters of Arnold Schwarzenegger in terms of strength. So this sat in my closet for quite a number of years, and I did not look at it, dismissing it as just another deed that I have to get to. But eventually I did. It's like that old saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, there's a corollary to that in the book world, I guess. The unexamined book is still worth buying. Finally, when I got to it, what made it interesting, I wouldn't be doing this video, is it is a deed from 1694, but it is a New York deed. So obviously those type of deeds early on in New York history are much rarer in commerce, and it concerns the purchase of a tract of land in 1694 from William Morris by the city of New York, from the town of Brooklyn, or Brooklyn as it was called then, long before Brooklyn was a high-tech postmodern mecca filled with unaffordable housing. Thanks to the miracle of Google Books research, something unimaginable even 15 years ago, I started to type in the precise wording of the deed, and lo and behold, it popped up immediately in 19th century references, including those of Henry Pierpont, who described this very deed as a foundational deed in the history of the city of New York. Now, when a bookseller hears the word foundational, you get immediately excited. Not only the emotional joy of holding something of historical importance, but of course, being a man of commerce, it's the cha-ching, cha-ching of the potential slot machine there. Why was it a foundational deed? Well, we have to think about Brooklyn and Manhattan history a little bit in the period. And in 1664, when the English took New Amsterdam from the Dutch and created the Corporation of the City of New York, New York City and Brooklyn became rival cities. And one of the things rival cities fought about during the period were water rights, rights to landings, transportation, ferries, etc., because those were clearly potential sources of revenue for urban advancement and development and, of course, power. This deed represents the very first time the city of New York purchased land in Brooklyn, specifically Brooklyn Ferry, to establish a legal claim to those absolutely essential water rights. And the tract is remarkable in history as well, because Brooklyn Ferry was really the place that less than 100 years later, George Washington would flee during the Battle of Long Island from. And Eventually it was named Fulton's Ferry in the 1800s, but it was a tract of land that really represented the shared history and development for Brooklyn and New York, even up to 1898 when Brooklyn became officially one of the 5 boroughs. But as Dickens would say, it is a tale of 2 cities. Now, one of the things I started to think about, this is like 30 minutes into that date when you have a weird question, it starts to go downhill, was if this was a museum-worthy piece, why isn't it in a museum? As a bookseller of hopeful conscience and adhering to the ethical laws of the ABAA, I have to fully examine the title of an item that I'm selling to make sure it's not stolen. And when I delved into the footnotes of those resources online, I found out that the deed was proudly held by the Office of the Comptroller of New York until 1910, when it was transferred in 1911 to the State Archives. Unfortunately, in 1911, there was a massive fire in the archives and many things were destroyed. And it's possible in the mayhem that the deed somehow entered private circulation, but that would not necessarily give me the title to sell it. So I started to become extremely uncomfortable and nervous that I'm holding a wonderful object that doesn't actually belong to me. Thankfully, I consulted a historian of the period, and as with many books, I learned something new, and this particular deed contains some very interesting language that it's recorded in the office of the town clerk of the city of New York. And when a deed has that language on it, what it means is it is the retained copy. In the 17th century, you would have 2 copies made of a deed for each party, in this case the city and the family, and they would be cut by a wavy line, which you can see here, called a chirograph, so that they could be placed together to authenticate the document. So this is not the copy that belonged to the city of New York, but it is the copy that was kept by the family, and that therefore I had a legal title to sell it, which made me extremely excited because, of course, this might be the only surviving copy now. The other copy could have been burned in that 1911 archive fire. So what do I do with it? And how do I evaluate something like this? Well, of course, I'm a bookseller, so as I said, I have to catalog it. And indeed, I did for the New York Antiquarian Book Fair last month. But what price to place on it? Well, I wanted to pick a price that was conveyed its historical importance, but was not too unreasonable in my mind. And truth be told, I plucked it from a hat and placed a value of $12,000 on it. Now, how did I get to that valuation? Well, it's very difficult to price unique items of historical importance, and I really don't know whether this is a $5,000 deed or a $50,000 deed in the right hands. That's the fun of the book business. And I've given many good things away cheaply. I started to investigate prices for comparable deeds I thought of importance. And one of the records that stood out to me was in 2019, Christie's sold a deed that belonged to Anthony the Turk, and it was billed as the first deed for somebody of Muslim descent in America, and it was for a tract of land near Coney Island. And I was at that auction, and the Brooklyn Historical Society bought it to great fanfare for the price of $27,500. So $12,000 did not seem an unreasonable price to place on this deed, and I hoped one that would make it affordable for an institution to purchase it, which is where I really feel it belongs. Now, I brought it to the New York Book Fair, and of course I did write the Brooklyn Historical Society, so if you're watching, hi there. But I did not receive a response, which again is a little bit dispiriting because you put all this energy into cataloging something you think is of great importance and then you don't get a reply. But I've learned over time, that does not mean they were not interested. Curators are bombarded with offers and catalogs and a million other duties, so they may not have even seen it. So I brought it to the fair basically and put it in the glass case, and nobody asked me about it. Now again, that does not mean it is not a wonderful object. When you go to one of these fairs, there are many fantastic objects, and all of these take people's time, and it's an overwhelming experience. And this is the type of object you really have to discuss with somebody and engage with them. Otherwise, they're just going to see it as a deed and a piece of vellum in a glass case and walk right by. So even though I was unsuccessful at the fair, I still think it is a marvelous item. Now, there are other avenues to try, which I have not yet. Institutions writing them directly, such as the New York Historical Society, which would be a fabulous place for it. But for the moment, it is available, and I have not received that ultimate validation of my conviction in how wonderful it is. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video and you'll subscribe for more videos about the antiquarian book business.